Thank you all for coming back. I believe it's time to get started. So our next speaker is, of course, Ian Worthington. He doesn't really require an introduction, but I'm nonetheless going to give one. He's Professor of Ancient History at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. To date, he has written 9 sole-authored books, 2 co-authored books, edited another 9 books, translated 2 volumes of the Greek orators, and written over 100 articles and essays on Greek history, oratory, and epigraphy. He is a specialist in Philip and Alexander and Hellenistic Greece in general. Yada, yada, yada. Here is Ian Worthington.
Thank you very much. Please don't stop. No, please don't stop. I'd like to thank David for inviting me to give a talk. I'm not joking there. He said, you're going to give a paper, aren't you? I said, I'll think about something. He said, Athenian war against Philip II. I said, oh, okay. So in a way, I was invited to give this paper. So here we go. Reading Demosthenes' speeches rather than listening to them, as the Athenians did, still gives us an idea of their rhetorical force, especially later ones like the 3rd and 4th Philippics and on the Chersonese. Even Philip II, against whom they were crafted, was supposed to have remarked that after hearing Demosthenes' public speeches, he would have, quote, elected him general to carry out the war against me, and that they were, quote, like soldiers because of their warlike power, Moralia 845d. Even if the veracity of this anecdote is suspect, we have to agree with it when we read the speeches. They really are forceful. So the question is, given Demosthenes' jingoistic rhetoric about the threat that Philip posed to Athens, and indeed Greek freedom, why were the Athenians so slow to act against him and end up, like Greece generally, suffering Macedonian hegemony? Various explanations have been advanced. No state could combat Philip's inexorable advance. He moved fast, and his intentions were opaque till the last minute. Citizens did not want to fight, but rely on mercenaries. The Athenians were still living in the heyday of the 5th century empire. Hence, they underestimated Philip and overestimated their own military clout. Or perhaps the people had tired of Demosthenes' so-called rhetoric of war that anchored all his speeches to do with the king. Now, certainly we can't discount things like Philip's speed and decisiveness, which even his nemesis Demosthenes admired, contrasting it with the apparent apathy and slowness of the Athenian assembly. Nor can we discount Philip's uncanny ability to play off one city against another, or the way he held his cards so close to his chest, and even the prowess of the Macedonian army, which had a near-perfect score, defeating enemies until Cynoscephalae in 197. But really, when you think about it, could any city have stopped Philip? And the answer is probably not. Chaeronea showed that even a coalition army headed by Athens and Thebes could not overcome him. And his defeats at Crocusfield and against the Triballi were anomalies in the big picture. Perhaps Demosthenes is going on like a cracked record about the need for citizens to fight Philip before it was too late, did turn some people off. Then again, Carthage must be destroyed had the desired effect, perhaps if only to stop Cato the Elder going on like a cracked record. Beyond Philip's obvious military and diplomatic abilities and the relative military impotency of the Greeks, Mossé had a different answer for the apparent dismal war effort against Philip. Seeing post-Peloponnesian War Athens as a shadow of its former self, she concluded that its democracy was a military failure like everything else. Hence, Philip's eventual success was not surprising, it was even inevitable. Now, I'm usually in favor of simple solutions because they often turn out to be right. democracy was hardly suited to running military operations. The Peloponnesian War showed that, because Athens had lost it the day it began. But I think there's a bit more to the issue of the Athenian war effort against Philip than blaming democracy per se, or viewing 4th century Athens as an inferior beast from the 5th century one, especially when we contrast Athens' earlier dealings with Philip with its later ones, as I'll argue. First, some comments on 4th century Athens. The often held belief that Athenians of the 4th century were less militaristic as a society, that people preferred mercenaries to fight for them rather than putting themselves in harm's way, and that, quote, the whole people preferred to spend more money on festivals than on administration, including military campaigns, is wrong. This comes from a fragment that I give you there from Theopompus. It's BNJ 115, fragment 213. And incidentally, I notice some of you are very naughty and refer to FGRH in your notes. Certainly, you will need BNJ for your revised chapters. And some people's notes are going to change quite substantially when you read the commentaries in BNJ. That image that we get, that I've just been describing, that description, as I said, is wrong. The 5th century attitude to war didn't suddenly stop in the 4th century, as several scholars have argued, not least Leopold Burckhardt in 1996 and Peter Hunt in 2010. As Hunt points out in his War, Peace and Alliance in Demosthenes' Athens, following, I hate to say this, Roisman's and Burckhardt's arguments about the value of military service for a citizen, litigants in law court speeches mention their military service as often as their financial benefactions. Hunt has an appendix, his Appendix C, showing 5 of 8 speeches from 377 to 356, 10 of 12 speeches from 355 to 338, and 7 of 9 speeches from 337 to 322 with military service claims in them. This is significant. This is about, 80 to 85%, because a speaker had to resonate with his audience. You can't, if your case is hanging on something, you can't afford to say anything that the audience will react against. The same, of course, is true of any venue, whether it's a law court or whether it's the assembly. So the Athenians regarded military service highly. Have you defended your city in wartime was asked of candidates for office. And someone throwing away a shield in battle could be indicted. Presenting a father's arms and armor to war orphans when they reached 18 was a solemn state ritual, as well as, like that other solemn state ritual, the epitaphios, another way to honor the dead. Recourse to the Persian Wars and the ancestors' bravery and patriotism was a common topos in oratory to encourage present-day Athenians to fight. And the Athenians rewarded exemplary military service. For example, in 394, Conon, and there's a name you've not heard before at this meeting, Conon received the first public statue in the city since that of the Tyrannicides. And statues of Conon and Timotheus were in the Agora and on the Acropolis. While in 357/6, Charidemus received Athenian citizenship and awards for his military service. Statues weren't cheap, and they were politically powerful, and citizenship was always coveted. So these awards to these guys were because of their military service and showed how much that was valued. Demosthenes' speeches are full of calls to oppose Philip, even if exaggerating his weaknesses and magnifying Athens' strengths. It would not be good for his career to advocate a cause that his audience no longer valued. Likewise, the epitaphioi of Demosthenes, delivered after Chaeronea, and that of Hyperides, delivered in spring 322, as I've argued elsewhere, praised the bravery and patriotism of those who paid the ultimate price, likening them to their 5th century ancestors, just as bravery pervades Demosthenes' On the Crown. One is reminded of these themes in Thucydides' Pericles Epitaphios. I prefer to call it Thucydides' Periclesis rather than just Periclesis. Nothing changes from the 5th to the 4th century then, does it? Philip Harding has made a case that when mercenaries were used, it was for distant campaigns, but that Athenian hoplites marched into battle closer to home. And he cites as examples Mantinea, Chaeronea, and Chronon. Likewise, citizens rode alongside metics and slaves in 5th and 4th century navies. Nevertheless, Hunt still sees less enthusiasm for war in the 4th century, though not necessarily, as he puts it, a shift in basic values. And he says that waging a campaign funded by tribute was not the same as paying for it out of your own pocket. No, it wasn't, I agree. But the Athenians were certainly not averse to mobilizing troops when the situation demanded it, even when in financial dire straits. And most importantly, even if that fight seemed against the odds. Two obvious examples, spanning about 20 years, are Nausicles' campaign in 352 to block Philip at Thermopylae, and the hoplites battling Philip at Chaeronea in 338. In 352 came news that Philip was at Thermopylae, having defeated Onomarchus and a Phocian army at the Battle of Crocusfield. He had neatly involved himself in the Third Sacred War, and the Phocian commander Phyalus expected him to march on Phocis next. Or he could march through Boeotia to invade Attica and invest Athens, which had been at war with him since 357. Eubulus for once dug into his pocket and supported the motion of Diophantus of Suetus to block Philip, an army of 5,000 men and 400 cavalry, along with 50 triremes, and costing the huge sum of 200 talents, was dispatched. When Philip reached the northwest entrance to Thermopylae, he found Nausicles barring his way and turned back. Athens was safe. The Battle of Chaeronea was the culmination of Demosthenes' anti-Macedonian stance. Philip had arrived at Elatea, from where he invited Thebes to join him in attacking Athens. And the Athenians, of course, had declared war on him in 340, something that he had engineered with his seizure of the grain fleet. The Athenians were panicked. They held an emergency assembly, but no speaker knew what to say. Then Demosthenes spoke up, making a meal out of his advice, quote, in the very midst of horrors. He persuaded the Athenians to send him to Thebes, to make an alliance and put together an army, hopefully with other states joining in. Incidentally, his realization that Athens needed allies to fight Philip and couldn't go it alone surely rebuts the view that the Athenians were too cocky about their own military capabilities and clout, and that explains why they went down to Philip. The danger from Philip in 352, the time of Nausicles, was great. If he invaded Attica, he might join with the Thebans and attack Athens. What if Nausicles' force wasn't enough to stop him? But luck was on the Athenian side. Philip might have got bogged down if he tried to force his way through. Everyone knew the story of the Persians held up at the pass in 480. And to circumvent Thermopylae would see him marching through hostile territory, vulnerable to Phocian attack. Hence, he took the sensible option and retreated. Chaeronea was a different story. Despite Philip's envoys in Thebes threatening retribution, Demosthenes succeeded in making that alliance with Thebes, and this is no small feat. Even the hostile Theopompus gives him a round of applause. Nonetheless, the Greek army was decisively beaten by Philip, with the Athenian hoplite contingent falling for the king's ruse and being all but wiped out. But then again, as Demosthenes epidictically emphasized in his crown speech, the Athenians had done the right thing to face Philip for Greek freedom. They could hold their heads up high, and so the battle became a moral and patriotic victory. All of this shows, and of course all of the other examples given by speakers at this meeting so far, shows that the Athenians were not afraid of flexing their military muscles in the 4th century, and moreover thought that they should do this when the occasion demanded. But when Nausicles and his men arrived back in Athens, they were disbanded, and no concerted policy to resist Philip was shaped until the following year, 351, when we encountered Demosthenes' first Philippic. In fact, Demosthenes had largely ignored Philip until now, making only a passing mention of him in his Against the Law of Leptines of 354. And in 352, in his Against Aristocrates, he raised the spectre of Philip more openly, but still underestimated him, seeing him as a distant enemy and that Thrace was far more of a concern to Athens and its security. Nausicles' success at Thermopylae had a profound influence on Demosthenes, who realized that with the right troop deployments, the Athenians could stop Philip if need be. And this is an important phrase, that, if need be. That was the basis of his first Philippic, the first speech with Philip as its real subject. Yet it was only one in a series of foreign policy speeches from those years. And it was delivered almost 5 years after the Athenians declared war on Philip. They'd done so in 357 over Amphipolis. And it failed. 13 years later, Philip conquered the Greeks, despite Demosthenes' warnings. So was Mossé right after all? Well, democracy was to blame, but to an extent. Demosthenes, for example, often berated venal and inconsistent leaders who spewed out an array of conflicting speeches, as well as berating the people for the dire situation in which they found themselves. These differences of Athenian leaders towards Philip carried over to the people, who were likewise confused and disagreed, yet they were the ones making the decisions. The lack of an elected elite making policy was a fundamental weakness of Athenian democracy, as a democracy cannot run a war. Likewise, the personal nature of politics put an emphasis on rhetorical skills rather than political acumen in swaying an assembly. And of course, money was tighter in the 4th century, and there was an impact, at least in the years after the Peloponnesian War, on military capability. So yes, there were issues with Athenian democracy. But now I'd like to consider another factor, perhaps even the major one, ooh, I'm putting all my eggs in one basket now, in understanding the Athenians' war effort against Philip. And that is their history with Sparta and with previous Macedonian kings. In doing so, I suggest their perception of the, quote, foreign threat from Philip helps to explain why they had a less bellicose attitude to him in the 350s and early 340s than they did in the later 340s. Now, when David first suggested this topic, I thought, I don't know what I can say that hasn't already been said. And then I'm almost at the end of a first draft of a book on the earlier Argead kings, so from Amyntas to Philip II, and I suddenly started to see patterns. And I'd already seen patterns in the last kings of Macedonia, which book came out this year, The Last Kings of Macedonia. Buy a copy, makes great Christmas presents. And when I started thinking about patterns about the Athenians' dealings with Macedonia, I started to see something that travels through the entire Argead and Antigonid dynasty in different ways. And I thought, this is it. This is, I hope, the novelty of the paper. Now, if I might echo my dear friend and colleague, Nick Secunda, if you don't agree with me, I don't care. I'm still going to get paid. I'm still not going to lose my job. But I think, this is hubris here, that there might be something in what I have to say, so therefore I'd be really interested to get your reaction. And if you think it's wrong, that's fine, as I said. I'm still flying premium economy back on Emirates. So here we go. We start with Pericles' speech to the Athenians in summer of 432 to persuade them to go to war against Sparta. And this is Thucydides 1, 140 to 144. Now, we've only got, what, 45 minutes here, 40 minutes? So I will expand on this in the chapter for the book, but I'm just giving you broad brushstrokes here. Now, in that speech, Pericles is out to show a weak enemy that Athens will overcome to protect its security and way of life. Among other things, he claimed that Sparta had acted against Athens' best interests, and that if the people didn't wage war, they would always face aggression from Sparta. And after all, in the First Peloponnesian War, Athens had suffered a major defeat in 457 at Tanagra. And if we believe Thucydides' truest explanation, the big Peloponnesian War was inevitable. War was coming, 123-6, especially as the Athenians had no plans to end expansion. Their response to Spartan complaints and demands shows that. Now, Pericles in his speech cast the Spartans as untrustworthy. They refused to comply with agreements like the clause in the 30 Years' Peace to submit issues to arbitration, and they preferred war over diplomacy. Yet in the examples Pericles gives, Sparta did resort to diplomacy on behalf of its allies and didn't discuss war with Athens for some years until Pericles forced the issue. In his breakdown of each side's resources, Pericles switches focus from just the Spartans to all the Peloponnesians. He says they have no financial resources, that they're weak, that they cannot levy a proper army or fleet compared to Athens, that they're always busy farming, that they're afraid, that they could never establish a base in Attica, and so on and so forth. Pericles stressed that the Athenians were the victims because war was being forced upon them. And he finished off with the appeal, so common in oratory, for the people to mirror the standards of their ancestors in the Persian Wars. And nearly a century later, substituting Philip for Sparta, the parallels between Pericles' scare tactic rhetoric and misinformation and those of Demosthenes are obvious. It is against Aristocrates. Philip is accused of breaking his promise to return Amphipolis to the Athenians, a promise which he never made. Founded by the Athenians in 437 to facilitate access to timber, Amphipolis had declared its independence in 424, and the Athenians always wanted it back. Demosthenes also claims that Philip had made several costly and wrong alliances and was Athens' very worst enemy. In the Olympiacs, for example, Demosthenes misrepresents Philip's character and his weaknesses, calling him untrustworthy, that his alliances are vulnerable, and even going so far as to say that his army wasn't all that good. So the Athenians, who have let slip opportunities before, can defeat him. On the Chersonese, Demosthenes argued that the Athenians must send Diopithes reinforcements or Philip would subdue the entire Chersonese, defeat the Athenians and end their democracy, and then go on to conquer all Greece. Philip, in this speech, was the enemy of democracy. He broke the peace of Philocrates, hence the Athenians were the victims. And in the third and fourth Philippics, the king's treacherous deeds affected the freedom of all Greece, and Philip, again, was the aggressor, the Athenians the victims. Of course, Pericles' and Demosthenes' speeches are crafted to portray their enemies badly. Pericles' patriotic appeal for the people to emulate their ancestors overlooks Sparta's role in the Persian Wars. It does so to magnify the Spartan threat to Athens' way of life, just as the Persians threatened freedom. Demosthenes was no different. Did Philip really break the peace of Philocrates? Did he really intend to wipe Athens off the face of Greece? To abolish its democracy? Was he really that weak with a lackluster army and a people who hated him? Well, of course not. We can't help but notice the inconsistency, it's rather delicious, in how an enemy can be a threat to Athens, yet at the same time have major weaknesses. If it's that weak, how can it be a threat? But leaving these considerations aside, we know that in the 430s, the Athenians accepted Pericles' warnings and waged war against Sparta. They didn't do so just because of his persuasive rhetoric, but because they'd had dealings with the Spartans before. They knew who they were. They knew where they were. They knew what they were capable of, from that foray into Attica to bring down the Pisistratiid tyranny to the First Peloponnesian War and their hostile attitude after it. Yet by contrast, our Athenians largely ignored Demosthenes' warnings about Philip's threats, even though they knew of his border expansions and his increasing influence in Greece. Why? Was it because that, unlike Sparta, Macedonia was further away, it was north of Mount Olympus, and Macedonian kings didn't have a history of marching into Attica? Now, we can't say for sure that these weren't factors, but I think a better answer lies with the Athenians' dealings with previous Macedonian kings, and to this I now turn. Athens' history with Macedonia had been checkered, to say the least. Macedonian kings had been consistent in their inconsistency to the city, and the Athenians had been much the same. Athenian expansion in the north, and especially the need of quality Macedonian timber, like firs and pines, for their fleet after Themistocles' naval reforms, brought them into contact and conflict with Macedonian kings. Timber was probably why the Athenians honored Alexander I as Proxenus and Euergetes in the mid-480s, which ties in with Mardonius sending him to Athens in winter of 480-79 to warn the people they risked destruction and should ally with Xerxes. Now, I'm just going to give you a few examples of Athens' dealings with kings. Don't worry, this is not a second-year Greek history survey course. The Athenians sent Alexander packing. After the Persian withdrawal from Greece, Alexander expanded his kingdom substantially, which led to more conflict with Athens. And in the 460s, he offered sanctuary to the exiled Themistocles. Flip-flopping relations between Perdiccas II and the Athenians occurred regularly. In 432, they made an alliance with Perdiccas' brother and Derdas of Elaminea against the king, with Thucydides telling us Perdiccas was, quote, a former friend and ally who had now become an enemy. After some ups and downs, Perdiccas and the Athenians allied in 431. But by 429, the Athenians were supporting Sitalces of Thrace against him, and he'd thrown his weight behind Brasidas, who was coaxing cities in the north to revolt from the Delian League. The pendulum swung back in 423, though the date is controversial, I admit, with a treaty between Athens and Perdiccas. It's 1 cubed 89. Among its terms were that Perdiccas could not export ores to anyone but the Athenians, so they had exclusive rights to ores. But by 413, the king had changed sides again, joining the Argive-Spartan alliance. Athens was not impressed and declared him an enemy, blockading Macedonian ports and ravaging Macedonian territory. By the summer of 414, Perdiccas was back on the Athenian side, serving with the general Euetion and a Thracian force in an unsuccessful attack on Amphipolis. So it's no surprise that Perdiccas gets a bad press for his cavalier treatment of Athens. Hermippus, for example, spoke of the king's ships, quote, loaded with his lies among goods appointed by the Athenians. Then there's King Archelaus, who came to power in 413 when the Athenians were in desperate need of timber and pitch after the Sicilian disaster, and so they were nice to him. In 411, he permitted Andocides to send timber for oars to the fleet at Samos, not for free, as Andocides speaks of not charging more than he paid for them. A fragmentary inscription of 4076 bestows proxenai euergete status on the king and his sons for letting Athens have timber and allowing Athenian shipwrights to go to Macedonia to build triremes. That's 1 Cubed 117, where Archelaus and shipwrights are restored but generally accepted in the inscription. To judge from anchors made of a dark stone not found in Athens but in the Chalcidice and Thessaly, triremes may have been built by Athenian shipwrights in Macedonia or the Chalcidice more than this one time. That information I got from an article, I forget the person's name, I think he's sitting between Dorothea and Neil O'Sullivan. Amyntas III faced all sorts of problems from the Illyrians and Olynthians and was even expelled for a time by a certain Argaeus. This might be the same Argaeus whom the Athenians supported in 359 when Perdiccas III and 4,000 Macedonians were killed against an invading Illyrian force. To combat all these threats, Amyntas III took a leaf out of Perdiccas II's book when it came to outside support and alliance. Among other things, he sold timber to Athens between 377 and 373, which is perhaps the context for an alliance of either 375 or 373. In perhaps 370, he sent timber to Timotheus, as well as cannily adopted Iphicrates as his son, perhaps to win over his father-in-law Cotys of Thrace. And at a meeting of the Greek states at Sparta in 371, he may even have supported Athens' claim to Amphipolis. This is very questionable, given Macedonian kings tended to thwart attempts to recapture the place. Our source is also Aeschines, and after what I said about Aeschines to Nick yesterday, I have to reject this as a lie. I have no choice. Finally, Perdiccas III was favorably disposed to Athens, but after Timotheus, who'd been campaigning to reassert the Athenians' possessions in the north, failed to take Amphipolis, the king installed a garrison there in 363, and it remained garrisoned when Philip II came to power in 359. When, contrary to their expectations, he kept hold of it in 357, they declared war on him. The Athenians' loss of Amphipolis in 424 was a major blow. Together with maintaining the presence of Athenian shipwrights in Macedonia, if this wasn't a one-off during Archelaus' reign, it dictated to a large extent their policy towards Macedonia from the 420s. Hence, declaring war on Philip over Amphipolis in 357 was no different from engagements with previous kings to try to retake the city. Now, what has all this got to do with the war effort against Philip II? Well, I think it's all to do with the perception of how Athens fared with Macedonian kings. Now, obviously, some events took place a long time before our period. It's surely certain that no one was still alive from the early days of the Peloponnesian War. But that wasn't meant to be a joke. But people born at the tail end of it, let's say by 405, would be in their mid-40s when Philip took the throne in 359, and early to mid-50s when Demosthenes delivered his first Philippic. These men might well recall life as a young boy or young man when Amyntas III was around, and certainly under succeeding kings down to Perdiccas III, the king before Philip II. Moreover, the frequent allusions to the Persian and Peloponnesian wars in the orators, the fact that Athens was an oral society, meant that stories of the past had a long life. Think also of Hermippus' quip that I mentioned before, of the ships loaded with lies, or of Aristophanes' frogs, which was first performed in 405 and performed in subsequent years, which, among other things, ridiculed those who had rushed to Macedonia in the death throes of the Peloponnesian War. So Athenians of Demosthenes' era had more than a passing knowledge of events involving Macedonia. In fact, men of the 4th century were particularly knowledgeable given their activity in political life, in the democracy. And I doubt that the assembly that decided to send troops to Diopithes would have voted to send more triremes than Alcibiades asked for to the unknown Sicily. If we accept this, if we accept that Athenians in Demosthenes' era had more than a passing knowledge of events, if they knew what had been going on in the past, then we start to see a pattern emerging. And that is, the Athenians could be friends and supporters of Macedonian kings, but even when they were against them, they didn't suffer undue harm. Now, the patterning, I think, is really important. It's something that I think when we look at through Athenian history, it's not just relevant to what I'm talking about. If you go into the Hellenistic period, there's one thing I tried to show in my Athens After Empire book from Alexander to Hadrian, is the fact that the defining pattern, I think, is Athenian resilience. Even when they do not have the same military power, they are still defiant against a conqueror. And that fits the pattern of the revolt of the Greeks after Philip's death, the Lamian War, the Chremonidean War, the support of Mithridates VI in the 80s, and even down to AD 13, when we hear of the Athenians supporting a revolt against probably some taxes imposed by Augustus. So patterns all the time. And with this particular pattern, we see that the Athenians made alliances with kings as and when it suited their needs, especially to procure timber. They allied with enemies of the kings as and when it suited their needs. They experienced kings curbing their influence in key areas, and they fought against them if there was a need. And at the end of the day, all parties regrouped and some semblance of normality returned till the next time. The Athenians' relations with Philip fall into this pattern. There were periods of peace and quiet, but there were times when they took him on to protect their interests. For example, and these are just a few examples, they supported the pretender Argaeus in 359, presumably hoping for the return of Amphipolis. In 357 or 356, they made an alliance with Illyrian, Thracian, and Paeonian kings, and even courted the Chalcidian League until Philip thwarted that coalition against him. They sent Nausicles to block Philip at Thermopylae. They sent 3 expeditions to help Olynthus in 349-8. They allied with Chersobleptes to help protect that vital grain route, as vital as the need for timber. They deployed Diopithes and an army to the Chersonese, siding with Demosthenes over Philip's protests about the military presence there. They went to war against Philip twice, the first one ending with a treaty of peace and alliance, the Peace of Philocrates in 346, and the second, of course, with Chaeronea in 338. My argument is that the Athenians acted towards Philip as they and their predecessors had done towards previous kings. They pursued diplomatic and military means. They suffered losses and enjoyed gains. They got what they wanted when it came to timber for their fleet, and at the end of the day, the city was unscathed. This was their history. Things in the past had always worked out, so why shouldn't they now with Philip? That, I think, is why we see a lackluster opposition to the king in the first several years of the war over Amphipolis, because they misjudged him, and why that war effort picked up dramatically in the later 340s when Philip was busy in Thrace, threatening the Chersonese and that precious grain route. Perhaps that also explains the failure of the First Philippic, delivered half a dozen years into the first war with Philip. Yes, the city couldn't afford to have a standing army and a strike force in the north, each of several thousand men, as Demosthenes had called for. It had been bloodied in the social war, and works like Demosthenes on the Cimeres and Xenophon's Poroi addressed the financial situation for a reason, as did Eubulus's fiscal conservatism. But perhaps a factor was that Nausicles' force had blocked Philip at Thermopylae in 352, sending him home and keeping Athens safe. It seemed history was repeating itself. The threat from Philip, the threat from a Macedonian king, was retreating. So why bother forking out money for an army that might not be needed? And the Athenians did spend money and prioritize military operations, as David Pritchard has shown in his Public Spending and Democracy in Classical Athens, or at least down to the 360s, which is where he takes it. It didn't all go on festivals. And that fragment of Theopompus I mentioned before is wrong about the Athenians spending more money on festivals and administration. As in that passage, he speaks of Chares' slowness, his life of luxury, how he embezzled money for his campaigns to fund his lifestyle and give supporters money in Athens. And the people let him off because they were the same. It's quite wrong because Chares was one of the more successful generals of the 360s, and for another, the passage shows that the Athenians committed money for military operations. Athens' defeat at Philip's hands was not due to a failure of democracy. It was more because the people misread Philip based on their history with Macedonia. This was history repeating itself or not repeating itself. Mossé was not right, and I think wrong to use a word like decline of 4th century Athens. Of course, the city was not as strong militarily or fiscally as in the 5th century. And in 348, the courts may have been suspended for lack of money. And this was an integral part of the constitution. And so to suspend an organ of it for lack of money shows this was a really serious situation. But as we've heard in papers at this meeting, its economy recovered. It could boast a formidable war fleet, stronger than the 5th century, as Vincent was talking about. There was a lavish building program in the Lycurgan era. People recognized its standing in Greece. Think of Harpalus fleeing there. And it spearheaded the Hellenic revolt when Alexander the Great died in June 323, more commonly and wrongly called the Lamian War. Decline is the wrong word. It comes from comparing the 4th century city to its 5th century self. It was simply a different city, but the people were not apathetic or afraid to take the offensive when they thought the situation called for it. That explains why the war effort was so slow against Philip and then accelerated so much later on when it was too late. And unfortunately, Demosthenes' rhetoric did not sway them enough. Unlike their dealings with previous Macedonian kings, which guided their beliefs, which guided their war effort, they had the misfortune to face the dynamic and unstoppable Philip II. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker and last speaker for today will be Lara O'Sullivan. Lara is a lecturer at the University of Western Australia and has written a significant number of articles on Athens and Alexander. And today, Lara will be speaking to us about Athenian military performance after 338 BC, the case study of the Lamian War. Lara.
Thank you very much, Misha. And let me echo the thanks of previous speakers to our organisers, David and Ian. It's been lovely to be here. It's been particularly nice to cross paths again with some old friends and also to put so many faces to names that have been with me as the authors of articles, but now I can connect with real people, so it's been a real pleasure. See, I was going to use that as an excuse to get you to answer my questions here. A little bit up?
Yeah.
Is that better? Don't want to send you all flying. Yeah, is that better?
Yeah.
Thanks, Angelos. Okay, so when David and Ian kindly invited me to contribute to this project, they assigned to me an overview of Athens' military performance between Chaeronea in 338 and the restoration of Athenian democracy in 307. But for my paper today, I've chosen a somewhat narrower focus. The Greek uprising against Macedonian hegemony in 323, I was going to say the Lamian War, I've been forbidden to call it that by Ian, so the Hellenic War, is of course Athens' major military event of this period, and the one most extensively attested. As such, it allows us the possibility of close scrutiny. There is, however, a more compelling reason for my selectivity today. Modern assessments have, I would submit, been unduly negative in their evaluation of Athens' performance in this war, most notably in the naval sphere of the campaign. There is something of a scholarly orthodoxy that it was at sea that the Greeks lost the war, but I think this is something we can viably question. So in what follows, I wish to offer something of a review of Athens' performance, highlighting not only what is generally conceded to have been a creditable performance on land, but also, more controversially, urging a reassessment of the naval campaign. I intend also to champion the acceptance of what Diodorus actually and explicitly says about the cause of the Greek defeat. Such review of the Lamian War in turn may cause us to question Mossé's grand picture of an Athens in decline and permit us to see instead a vibrant polis still performing its ancestral role as the champion of Greek liberty before the curtailment of its own democracy at the end of the war. Before I turn to Athens' performance in the war itself, some preliminary observations may be in order. One facet of the negative assessment of 4th century Athens is a tendency to criticise its military decisions. So let's begin with the decision itself to go to war in the wake of Alexander's death. On this decision, Diodorus reports scathing views. He describes the decree authorising the war as having been passed more promptly than was wise, and describes to the Greeks who were superior in understanding a view that the Athenians had acted inexpediently. I would suggest, however, that the Athenian demos here made a not irrational assessment of its chances. It was not just the death of Alexander himself that made the gamble worth it, significant though the absence of that king undoubtedly was. What is too often ignored is the very real uncertainty about the scale of resources that Alexander's former regent Antipater could hope to deploy against the Greek rebels. At the outbreak of the war, the land forces of the Athenian general Leosthenes significantly outstripped those available to Antipater. Further, Athens' dockyards housed over 400 vessels. Antipater initially had at his disposal a fleet of only 110 triremes, recently deployed by Alexander to transport treasure to his homeland. Little wonder then that Antipater's first acts were to plea for aid from his fellow Macedonian marshals, Craterus in Cilicia and Leonatus in Hellespontine Phrygia. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we know, as did Diodorus, whose negative appraisal of the outbreak of war may be shaped by such knowledge, that Antipater received their support. Its provision, however, was by no means assured at the outset. The dynamic between Antipater and Craterus in the last months of Alexander's life was ambiguous at best. Craterus had been sent out by his king to replace Antipater, and their personal relationship may thus have been tense. The subsequent settlements struck between the Diadochoi at Babylon had done little to clarify their respective positions. In contemplating war, the Athenians may well have factored in the possibility that Craterus or Leonatus would choose not to cross into Europe, given the presence of other key power brokers in Babylon. Indeed, both Craterus and Leonatus had, at various stages in the negotiations at Babylon, been assigned forms of tutelage over one of the kings, and Craterus, according to Dexippus at least, the prostasia of the entire kingdom, had either wished to press for such status a move eastward rather than west would have been on the cards. The Greeks may have well further calculated that if they did cross into Europe, the Macedonian elite would contend for power between themselves. Antipater's prestige at this point was not untarnished. Alexander's intentions for his former regent had been frustratingly unclear, prompting Arrian to downplay rumours of a rift between them. It would seem that Antipater had harboured uncertainties himself, for he had chosen not to comply immediately with his monarch's summons. Any such ambiguity around Antipater's standing with Alexander may have rendered him vulnerable and undermined the willingness of the Macedonian elite to back him. For their part, the Athenians seem to have been actively exacerbating such frictions. It's tempting at any rate to see Hyperides' proposal of honours for Antipater's son Iolaus for his alleged poisoning of Alexander as a move for Athens' own benefit to create opprobrium around Antipater's family and to isolate him from the other Diadokoi. They were looking also to exploit the intra-Macedonian rivalries by engaging at some point in intrigues with Antipater's rival Perdiccas. As it was, Macedonian help for Antipater was forthcoming. Even so, Leonatus' assistance was driven by self-interest. Antipater's appeal gave him legitimate reason to cross into Europe to pursue the prospect of marriage to Alexander's full sister Cleopatra, a prospect that betrays the scale of Leonatus' independent ambitions. And it's noteworthy that Antipater is said to have welcomed his ally's death in battle near Lamia. Again, all this points to the validity of Athens' likely guesstimates of the fractures and tensions among the Diadokoi. The Athenians' gamble to go to war was not an irrational calculation. We also have enough information on the Lamian War to engage with one of Mossé's touchstones of Athenian decline, the increasing reliance on mercenaries in place of citizen soldiers. Athens did indeed commit more mercenaries than citizen troops to the land campaign. Diodorus mentions 5,500 Athenians, but 10,000 mercenaries funded by Athens in his early tallies of Leosthenes' land forces. And Burkett plausibly posits the hiring of a similar number in addition to service Athens' fleet, the launch of which will have required immense manpower. Athens' naval figures in the war are notoriously problematic. The highest number of Athenian vessels stated by Diodorus to have been mobilised is 170, entailing, on traditional calculations, the service of some 32,000 rowers alone, to say nothing of marines. So if Burkett is right about the additional naval mercenaries, this war will have placed an immense strain on Athens' financial resources, a strain of which we can glimpse reflections in the honours voted to benefactors of the fleet at this time. The city was, however, far from shirking a commitment of citizen forces to the war. Diodorus affirms that all citizens up to the age class of 40 were enrolled for the land offensive, with 7 tribes allocated to campaigning in the north with the combined Greek force, and the remaining 3 deputed to the defence of Attica itself. Now, I don't want to reignite the conversation necessarily of yesterday, but if I touch on numbers just briefly, on Professor Secunda's calculations of the Athenian population, the totals of Athenians mobilised, as mentioned in our sources, and if we extrapolate from the 5,500 documented in the 7 tribes, we're seeing a full mobilisation of 7,857 Athenians from all 10 tribes, then this approximates quite closely to the total citizen figure for these age groups predicted in the life tables. There's a striking corollary of this. On Secunda's reckoning, any mobilisation of the Athenian fleet in this war will have entailed the recall of the land army, with still a heavy reliance on metics, foreigners and slaves to provide the numbers for the ships. Now, as we're all aware, long a champion of a higher Athenian population figure, Hansen pushed back against these calculations, arguing that the Athenians cannot have devoted every able-bodied citizen under 40 to the land army, and that there must have been Athenian manpower designated for the fleet. Thankfully, for our purposes, or my narrow purposes here, a resolution of this dispute is perhaps unnecessary. Whether, with Secunda, citizens were forced to double as hoplites and sailors, or whether with Hansen we have two separate groups, Athens must have mobilised virtually all its available citizens within the specified age cohorts for its land and naval campaigns, with us seeing a serious military commitment of Athenian citizens themselves. By land, not of the scale of the pandemos mobilisation that we saw for Chaeronea, but still notably the deployment of Athens' largest fleet in the 4th century and more than the 134 ships sent in the famed expedition to Sicily in 415. But what then of the performance of these Athenian forces? We scarcely need a reminder here, of course, that the Athenian-led Greek coalition ultimately failed and did so with punitive consequences for Athens itself, with a victorious Antipater curtailing the citizen body. That the Athenian forces acquitted themselves well on land is, however, often conceded, and it will not go amiss here to review briefly the Greek victories detailed by Diodorus. First, at Plataea against a Boeotian army, which had come out in favour of Macedon. Then the Allied numbers bolstered by the adherence of the Thessalians to their cause against Antipater and his force of 13,000 Macedonian infantry and 600 horse, with Antipater subsequently besieged in Lamia. A third victory was scored in Thessaly against the forces of Leonatus, who'd crossed from Hellespontine Phrygia to aid Antipater, with more than 20,000 infantry and 1,500 horse. In his summing up of the narrative down to the spring of 322, Diodorus indeed describes the affairs of the Greeks as in thriving condition. And when he resumes his narrative, he even alludes to the Greeks as despising the enemy because of their former good fortune. We learn later, in the context of the Greeks' eventual submission, that Antipater's situation in Lamia had become so perilous that he'd sent envoys asking for peace and had been rebuffed. The positive impression from Diodorus can be bolstered from other sources. Hyperides' Epitaphios and the 6th letter in the corpus of Demosthenes' correspondence also allude to successes, perhaps scored after Leosthenes' death at Lamia in the winter of 3232, but before the arrival of Leonatus in spring 322. To these successes in the north can be added the action reported by Plutarch. He records a successful repulsion of a Macedonian invading party at Rhamnus by Phocion, who led out the levies from the 3 tribes deputed for the defence of Attica. There is, in addition, a brief note in Strabo that the Euboean city of Styra was destroyed in the Malian War by Phaedrus, the general of the Athenians. This too is usually understood as pertaining to the Lamian War. Writing of the first months of the war in particular, Plutarch goes as far as to claim that Athens was receiving frequent reports of successes from their military front, so much so that the city was continuously holding festivals and making sacrifices of glad tidings. The tables would change for the Greeks, of course, at the final battle at Cranon in 322, when Craterus managed to join with Antipater's troops. But one could argue that even there the defeat was not overwhelming. When the weight of Macedonian numbers began to turn the battle, the Greeks were able to retreat to higher ground in good order, and the next day the Greek generals were able to contemplate a continuation of the war. These successes might be taken as indicators of significant competence among the Athenian military commanders. Certainly the source traditions speak highly of them. We would expect the Epitaphios ascribed to Hyperides to be laudatory of Leosthenes, although the extent of the emphasis on the individual general in this funeral speech is remarkable. But it is striking that Diodorus, whose Lamian narrative is in many respects quite hostile to the Athenian venture, chooses to echo Hyperides' sentiments, affirming that Leosthenes was buried with the honours of a hero because of the glory he'd gained in war. Diodorus further praises Leosthenes' successor, the Athenian Antipholus, as a man outstanding in military genius and courage. The successes of the land campaign may suggest too that the ephebic training system employed at Athens through the Lycurgan period could be judged something of a success. Although, of course, with the exception of Phocian's defence of Attica, and despite Hyperides' misrepresentations to the contrary, the victories secured by the Greek side cannot be ascribed solely to the prowess of the Athenian forces. The mercenaries enlisted by Leosthenes are hailed by Diodorus as men who were masters of warfare. Further, in the Greek victories scored by the forces being brought to Antipater's aid by Leonatus, it was the Thessalian cavalry who were key. And it was their presence also that is said to have deterred Antipater from risking battle after his forces had been bolstered by those of Leonatus. Even at Cranon, the Thessalian cavalry gained the upper hand and yielded only with the withdrawal of the Greek infantry to higher ground. In the light of this good performance by the Greek allies by land, it's become an entrenched orthodoxy in scholarship that this war was in fact lost by Athens at sea. Indeed, there's a view stretching back to Droysen and Beloch that a naval loss at Amorgus, a battle singled out for attention in some ancient traditions, and which is, as a result, often assumed to have been the most significant naval clash, that it was something of a naval counterpart to the Battle of Salamis, with Salamis forging the foundation of Athenian naval power and Amorgus marking its total destruction. In the time that remains, I'd like to scrutinise this orthodoxy and to re-examine the evidence around Athens' naval performance in this war. I'm not aiming to provide a comprehensive reconstruction of the naval campaign, the narrative of which is notoriously contentious, heavily reliant as it is on a perilously brief notice, some mere 3 sentences in Diodorus, which leaves unclear much about the locations, numbers and sequence of engagements by sea, and which may not be a synopsis of the whole naval war at all. Nor am I aiming to deny that the Athenians and their Greek allies suffered naval defeats. Diodorus opens his brief summary with a statement of Macedonian dominance in the Aegean in the spring of 322, and from that starting point subsequently catalogues only Macedonian victories under the leadership of one Clytus. Attic inscriptions too portray the loss of Athenian ships and perhaps by implication an Athenian defeat at the Hellespont. What I do wish to suggest though is that both the scale and the significance of these losses are far from clear. The complexity of assessment is best illustrated in connection with the Battle of Amorgus itself. This is a battle which our chief narrator of the Lamian War, Diodorus, does not see fit to mention by name at all. Instead, the supposed importance of the Amorgos clash to the ultimate outcome of the war is predicated in part on the conjecture that it was the last and thus decisive naval engagement, which is a conjecture nowhere explicitly supported by our sources, and in part on the fact that it's the only naval encounter deemed important enough for acknowledgement on the Marmorparium, where Amorgus appears in the entry for the Archon year 3232. In reality, all we can take from the Marmor is that Amorgus was the most significant naval clash of that Archon year, which was not the final year of the war. The same entry documents the siege of Lamia. That was a dramatic event, and it gave its name, wrongly, to the treatment of the war in an epic by the apparently lamentable poet Koirolus, and from that epic poetry percolated into later literature as the name of this engagement. But militarily, Lamia was inconsequential. Amorgos may have been likewise. Overall, the Marmor is an unreliable index of significance. It documents no specific battles for the next year, 3221, in which the war ended, thus ignoring Cranon. And here we might contrast Plutarch, who in his life of Demetrius states that the liberation of Athens in 307 came in the 15th year from the time of the Lamian War and the Battle of Cranon. Plutarch, meanwhile, mentions Amorgos in two anecdotes, but in these he gives rather different impressions of the Athenian losses. In one, Amorgos is described as a disaster for Athens, while in the other the Macedonians are credited with sinking a mere 2 or 3 triremes. Both anecdotes are polemical and are clearly the product of literary shaping. The first serves as a vehicle for the denigration of the Athenian politician Stratocles, who allegedly and duplicitously concealed news of a crushing defeat from the Athenians, while the second mocks the pretensions of the Macedonian admiral Clytus, who styled himself as the new Poseidon on the basis of his supposedly trivial victory. Neither anecdote, I would submit, allows us to make a secure judgment on the severity of the loss. We also have the inscribed Athenian naval inventory for the year in which the Naumachia at Amorgos occurred. On this account of Athenian ship numbers, taken at the close of the Archone year, the naval epimeletai catalogued some 315 triremes and likely 50 quadriremes. Now, this is indeed a reduction on the numbers recorded for the year 3254, when some 360 triremes and 50 quadriremes were logged. But it scarcely marks a catastrophic collapse of the Athenian fleet. In an attempt to reconcile these naval records with the supposedly disastrous nature of the loss at Amorgos, Ashton suggested that the battle took place so late in the Archone year that notifications of the losses did not reach Athens in time for the naval curators to register them in their count of the ships. On this reconstruction, the decline that is present in the numbers for 32322 is the product of a more realistic assessment by the epimeletai of the number of seaworthy vessels at Athens' disposal, rather than capturing a less absolute defeat at Amorgos. Now, this is possible, but it is totally unwarranted given the lack of any definitive evidence of the true scale of the Amorgos defeat. If we return to our one narrative of the Lamian War, that of Diodorus, we find only one naval theatre mentioned, a clash near the Echinades, where he says Clytus destroyed a large number of the ships of the enemy. This at least seems to betoken a serious loss. But even here there are problems for our evaluation of Athens' performance. The ships are not directly said to be Athenian, and Diodorus' phrasing might indicate a distinction between the Echinades clash and the formal Naumachii waged between Clytus and the Athenian commander Evetion, leaving open the possibility that this was some kind of other engagement. So, in terms of evidence for a collapse of Athens' naval capability, we are far from having a compelling case. There is a second angle from which Athens' naval performance has been adjudged a failure, and that's a strategic one. Prevalent in the scholarship is a belief that the fundamental aim of Athens' naval endeavour was to prevent the crossings of Leonatus and then Craterus to aid the beleaguered Antipater, and concomitantly, an assumption that Clytus's key purpose was to ferry across Craterus's troops from Cilicia. Bosworth raised a rare voice of dissent when he questioned whether such a blockade could ever have been seriously considered by the Athenians, given that both sides of the Hellespont were in Macedonian hands at the start of the war, and that Athens' clerici and the Chersonese were likely long gone. In fact, in our assessment of objectives, we are again on shakier ground than is often recognised. Clytus's assumed coordination with Craterus is a case in point. While Clytus was among those sent homewards with Craterus by Alexander from Opicin 324, we cannot assume that the major fleet subsequently constructed in Cilicia and commanded by him in the Lamian War was intended primarily as an instrument for Craterus's repatriation of Alexander's veterans. It's never explicitly designated thus in our sources, and Alexander himself had had other ambitious plans for naval conquest in the West. Clitus's own grandstanding after the Lamian War, not only masquerading as Poseidon, but conducting business while walking on purple tapestries, hints at significant independent ambitions, to which his subsequent securing of a satrapy at the conference of Triparadisus also speaks. And his connection to Craterus was not so absolute as to prevent him for a time aligning himself with Craterus's arch-rival Perdiccas in the latter's attempt on Egypt. The problematic nature of Clitus's supposed subordination to Craterus is further evident in the fact that the only locations in which Clitus is explicitly linked in any sources are Amorgus and the Echinades, neither obviously key to movements of troops under Craterus from Cilicia. In reality, the interplay between the land and naval actions may have been far more fluid and nebulous than is generally allowed. A nebulousness that may explain Diodorus's lack of attention to the naval campaign and lack of integration between his naval and land narratives, and may explain too the difficulties that have beset modern attempts to align the naval and land theatres. It may be observed, for example, that all three of the known theatres of naval activity in the Lamian War, that is the Hellespont, Amorgos, the Echinades, all sit on Athenian trade routes. The route from Egypt and Cyrene, on which Amorgos lay, had become increasingly important to Athens in the 330s. Into the 320s, there was intense interest in sources to the west, including the Po Valley, to the extent that Athens had sent out a colony to the Adriatic for the protection of this trade in 325-4. Hence, perhaps, the action near the Echinades, off the Acarnanian coast. Control of trade routes had been an important military objective for all Aegean powers in the 4th century. Demosthenes had claimed it as a deliberate strategy of Philip of Macedon in the 350s and 340s, with the Athenians even voting war in response, as we've heard in earlier papers. And its importance had not diminished for players subsequently. As Professor Gabrielson's important work has shown, Athens' own naval mobilisations post-Chaironeia had been predominantly for the protection of grain envoys. And control of grain routes was also clearly a concern for all sides in the Persians' so-called Aegean War against Alexander. It remained a matter of national security in the Lamian War period, with a food shortage very much still current. So I wonder then if the Macedonian domination of the sea, initially alluded to by Diodorus in his naval excursus, in fact points in a similar direction. And thus the naval clashes of the war were chiefly contestations for such control. The distinction, noted earlier, that some see in Diodorus between Clitus's formal battles with the Athenian fleet and his action at the Echinades perhaps derives from the latter being an attack on grain transport vessels with their protective convoy. We could, in passing, also countenance the likelihood that Athens directed naval resources to the prevention of the Samians' reclamation of their island. For the fate of Athens' Samian clerices, which had been, of course, threatened by Alexander's exiles decree, was at the very heart of Athens' war. Given this possibility of a variety of other objectives for the Athenian fleet, I don't think we can conclude from the crossings of Leonatus and then Craterus that the Navy had abjectly failed in its mission. Viewed as a whole then, I think we may have a less decisive naval campaign than the general consensus would admit, one not unambiguously indicative of a collapse of Athenian naval capacity. I think that Diodorus, with his insertion of a couple of lines about the naval sphere in his account of 322, intends rather to give us a sense of a fight evenly poised. The Greeks had the best of it by land, the Macedonians by sea, and the war might ultimately tip either way. and that he's not guilty of obscuring a different reality as constructed in the modern view, namely that Athenian losses at sea had quashed all their chances in the war. I'd submit we can instead take Diodorus at face value about the trajectory of the final demise of the Greek effort. He is in fact quite explicit about that trajectory. So to finish off, let us return to his conclusion of the land campaign. Diodorus refers to the deliberations of the Greek generals in the wake of Cranon, and his account flags their belief that, despite their recent defeat, the war might yet be winnable. The crux was the absence at that time of allied contingents from the land campaign, most notably the Aetolians. They'd been granted permission by Leosthenes, while Antipater was under duress, contained in Lamia, to go home for the present because of some national business. Diodorus thereafter mentions the continued absence not only of the Aetolians, but also of not a few of the other Greeks, in the clash that saw the death of Leonatus, with the result that the Greek force that faced the combined Macedonians after the arrival of Craterus in Thessaly as far inferior in numbers to their foe. The Greek leaders at Cranon believed, however, that their position was redeemable should the Aetolians return. If Diodorus is right that the Aetolians amassed an army of over 12,000 against the Macedonians a year later, that Greek assessment is not unfounded. The perception that it was the missing allies who were key is not confined to Diodorus. It was still circulating when the Suda was compiled. There it's claimed that Antipater was saved when the Aetolians withdrew, and then the others. This again strongly suggests that it was not the decisive fate of the naval war that determined the Greeks' deliberations, and as an explanation, it is itself legitimate and sufficient. We have seen above that Athens' own resources were at full stretch, and on that basis, the temporary withdrawal of their most numerous ally will have had a serious impact on the short-term viability of the land campaign, regardless of any losses or wins sustained on the naval front. Furthermore, the undecided nature of the military situation after Cranon is evident in the ensuing exchanges. When the Greeks determined to treat with Antipater, it was not abject surrender that their heralds conveyed, but a proposal of a truce. They even felt strong enough to reject Antipater's initial response, which was an insistence that the cities come to terms one by one rather than en masse. This suggests that, against their own temporary manpower crises, the Greeks were perhaps reckoning on pressures on Antipater and Craterus to pause hostilities in Greece so that they might themselves engage with the Diadocan turmoil to the east. Aware too that there were higher powers than Antipater, in the persons of the Macedonian kings and their regent, the Greeks were also engaged in intrigues themselves with that alternative power broker, Perdiccas. This was then still a fluid situation, not one in which the fate of Athens had already been demonstrably determined. There are tantalising hints of such remaining Athenian ebullience in fragments from Dexippus's Tarmet Alexandron, in which Dexippus imagines an exchange between Athenian envoys and Antipater at some point after Cranon. Dexippus's Athenians are strikingly uncowed. They announce their intentions to send envoys to the kings and seem to demand concessions from Antipater, provoking rebukes from that Macedonian on their ill-founded confidence. For all its late rhetorical nature, Dexippus's portrayal of the dynamic at this meeting may not be completely unfounded. It was only Antipater's ensuing military action against individual cities and his bestowal of generous terms on their capitulation that ultimately isolated the Athenians to the point that they were forced into submission. But even then, on the point of capitulation, the Aetolians and the Athenians consulted once more with their generals about pressing on with the conflict. In sum, then, in the Lamian War, the Athenians had resumed the mantle of the champions of Greek freedom, a mantle they deemed their ancestral inheritance. They committed serious resources to the fight, both financial and in terms of citizen bodies, and on my reckoning had not been decisively defeated even by sea. The failure came instead from within the alliance. The rallying call of Hellenic freedom, with its overtones of Athenian hegemonic aspiration, was not enough to maintain the commitment of other poleis, particularly those which, unlike Athens and Aetolia, were not facing significant material losses from the implementation of Alexander's exile's decree. Further, the nadir of Athenian power is to be found not in military defeat in the Lamian War, but in the terms imposed by Antipater in the wake of that capitulation. It was these terms that significantly curbed the Athenian citizen body and thus the military capacity of the city, and crippled the democratic vigour that had, in vital ways, survived in Athens to this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura.